I never imagined the worst humiliation of my life would happen in a room filled with flowers, music, and applause, a place meant to celebrate family, because at my own son's wedding, with hundreds of eyes watching, he looked straight at me and shouted that his wife did not want me there and that I should leave immediately. And in that moment I understood something cold and final. I was no longer a father to them. I was an obstacle. So I walked out without raising my voice, without arguing, without begging, and I let them believe they had won. But silence can be far more dangerous than anger, because the next morning when my phone rang and my son's voice calmly demanded my property papers as if nothing had happened, I realized the wedding was never the end of the story. It was the beginning of their plan, a plan built on greed, entitlement, and the belief that I was weak, disposable, and easily controlled. What they did not know was that every insult, every humiliation, every smile they shared behind my back had already pushed me past the point of forgiveness. This is not just a story about betrayal. It is about patience, power, and the moment when a man everyone underestimated finally decides to stop protecting people who never protected him. If you stay with me to the end, you will see how quiet endurance turns into precise revenge, how every move they thought was clever becomes their downfall, and how the future they were so eager to steal collapses in a way they never saw coming. My name is Richard Lawson. I am 68 years old, a retired chief financial officer who spent 42 years building a reputation on precision, patience, and integrity. My wife Eleanor passed away 2 years ago, and since then, I have learned that grief is not the hardest thing a man can endure. Betrayal by your own blood cuts deeper than any loss. The invitation arrived 3 weeks before the party, printed on cream-colored cardstock with gold embossing, Ethan and Vanessa's 20th wedding anniversary celebration. I remember holding it in my hands, feeling something close to hope for the first time in months. 20 years of marriage was worth celebrating, and despite the growing distance between my son and me, I believed this might be an opportunity to rebuild what had quietly crumbled since Eleanor's death. I dressed carefully that evening, choosing the navy suit Eleanor had always said made me look distinguished. I even stopped to buy flowers for Vanessa, white roses wrapped in silver paper, because that is what a father-in-law does when he wants to show respect. I arrived at their home precisely at 7, as the invitation requested, and for a moment, standing on their manicured lawn surrounded by elegant guests, I allowed myself to believe I was still part of this family. That illusion lasted approximately 4 minutes. The young woman at the entrance checked her list twice before finding my name. She seemed confused, then led me through the crowded garden past the main tables where Ethan's business partners and Vanessa's social circle were seated. We walked past the bar, past the string quartet, past every seat that mattered, until we reached a small table near the kitchen entrance. The chairs were mismatched. The tablecloth had a stain. From where I sat, I could barely see the main stage where Ethan and Vanessa would later give their speeches. I was positioned like hired help, close enough to witness the celebration but far enough to be forgotten. I told myself it was an oversight, a seating chart mistake. These things happen at large parties. Then I watched Vanessa work the room. She moved through the crowd like a queen greeting her subjects, her smile bright and practiced. She embraced old friends, kissed cheeks, laughed at jokes I could not hear. She welcomed strangers with more warmth than she had ever shown me in 20 years. And when her eyes swept across the garden and briefly landed on my corner by the kitchen, she looked through me as if I were a piece of furniture. No wave, no acknowledgement, nothing. Ethan found me eventually, but only because I walked toward him during a lull between toasts. I had prepared a few words, a simple blessing for their marriage, the kind of thing a father says when he wants his son to know he is proud despite everything. I touched Ethan's arm and said I would like to offer a toast. His reaction still burns in my memory. He pulled away slightly, glanced toward Vanessa across the room, and said loud enough for nearby guests to hear, "Dad, this isn't the time. Maybe later, okay?" He said it with the kind of practiced patience people use with confused elderly relatives. I saw 2 women exchange glances. I heard Vanessa's voice behind me, soft but carrying, telling someone, "We're worried about him, honestly. He's been so confused since Eleanor passed. Memory issues. You know how it is." I stood there, holding my glass of champagne that no one had offered to refill, and I understood. This was not an oversight. This was architecture. Every detail of my humiliation had been designed. From the seating chart to Ethan's rehearsed dismissal to Vanessa's whispered concerns about my mental state. They were building a narrative, laying groundwork for something I could not yet see clearly. And they believed I was too old, too grief-stricken, too broken to notice. Eleanor's voice came to me then, clear as the day she had said it. We had been sitting on our back porch 5 years ago, watching Vanessa help Ethan load their car after a holiday dinner. I had commented on how attentive she seemed. Eleanor had not looked away from the window when she replied, "She smiles with her mouth, Richard. Never her eyes. Watch her carefully. Someday you will need to remember that." I set my untouched champagne on a passing waiter's tray. I straightened my jacket, the navy one Eleanor loved. I walked through the garden without saying goodbye to anyone, because there was no one there who deserved my farewell. I did not cause a scene. I did not give them ammunition. I simply left, letting them believe their strategy had worked. As I walked to my car alone, I heard Vanessa's laughter echo across the garden. She thought she had won. She had no idea my wife had prepared me for this moment 2 years before she died. The drive home took 20 minutes, but I do not remember most of it. My hands moved the steering wheel. My foot pressed the pedals. My eyes watched the road, but my mind was somewhere else entirely. It was replaying every moment of that party, cataloging every detail the way I had cataloged financial discrepancies for 4 decades. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I had already begun to see the pattern. The house was dark when I entered. I had not left any lights on because I had expected to return late, full of champagne and conversation, perhaps even carrying some small hope that my relationship with Ethan might be healing. Instead, I was home before 9 o'clock, standing in an empty foyer that still smelled faintly of Eleanor's perfume even after 2 years. Some nights that scent comforted me. Tonight it felt like a summons. I did not turn on the living room lights. I did not pour myself a drink or sit in my usual chair by the window. Instead, I walked down the hallway to the small study that had been Eleanor's sanctuary during her final years. Her desk still sat beneath the window, exactly as she had left it. I had not changed anything in this room. Her reading glasses still rested on a stack of books. Her favorite pen, a silver fountain pen I had given her for our 30th anniversary, still lay across a leather notebook. I lowered myself into her chair and let the silence settle around me like a familiar blanket. Eleanor had always been the perceptive one in our marriage. I dealt in numbers, in balance sheets, in the concrete language of profit and loss. She dealt in people. She could read a room the way I read a financial statement, identifying weaknesses and strengths that others missed entirely. During her final months, when the cancer had already begun its slow consumption of her body, that perception had sharpened into something almost unsettling. She had become obsessed with watching Vanessa. At the time, I thought it was the medication affecting her mind, or perhaps the fear of leaving me alone with a daughter-in-law she had never fully trusted. Eleanor would sit at this very desk for hours, writing in journals I was not permitted to read, making phone calls she did not explain. When I asked what she was doing, she would smile, that mysterious smile of hers, and say only, "Preparing." I never pressed further. I wish now that I had. One conversation from those final weeks returned to me with sudden clarity. We had been sitting together in the garden, wrapped in blankets despite the warm afternoon, because Eleanor was always cold by then. She had taken my hand and looked at me with those sharp green eyes that illness had not dimmed. "When the time comes," she said, "you'll know what to do. Everything you need is where it's always been." I had assumed she was talking about the will, the insurance policies, the practical matters of death. Now, sitting at her desk in the darkness, I wondered if she had meant something else entirely. The phone rang at 9:30. I recognized Vanessa's number on the screen and felt a cold clarity settle over me. This call was not concern. This was reconnaissance. She wanted to assess the damage, to confirm that her carefully orchestrated humiliation had achieved its intended effect. For a moment, I considered not answering. Then I realized that silence would only make her suspicious. Vanessa expected a broken old man. I would give her exactly what she expected. I answered on the 4th ring, letting my voice carry a slight tremor. "Hello, Richard. It's Vanessa." Her tone was warm, solicitous, absolutely false. "I just wanted to check on you. You left the party so early, and Ethan and I were worried. Are you feeling all right?" I paused longer than necessary before responding, as if gathering my thoughts was difficult. I'm fine, Vanessa. Just tired. These big events take a lot out of me these days. Of course they do. I could hear the satisfaction beneath her sympathy. You know, Richard, we really should talk about getting you some help around the house. Someone to check in on you, make sure you're eating properly, handling your affairs. It's what Eleanor would have wanted. Maybe you're right, I said, letting my voice fade slightly. I've been so confused lately. The party was lovely, though. Thank you for inviting me. The conversation lasted another few minutes, but the substance was over. Vanessa had heard what she needed to hear. An old man, declining, disoriented, grateful for whatever scraps of attention his family chose to throw him. When we hung up, I knew she would immediately call Ethan with her report. The old man is breaking down. We can move forward with the plan. I set the phone on Eleanor's desk and allowed myself a small, cold smile. For 42 years, I had served as chief financial officer for one of the largest manufacturing firms in the Midwest. I had navigated hostile takeovers, survived 3 recessions, and once spent 14 months untangling a fraud scheme that had been designed by people far more intelligent than Vanessa Lawson. My reputation had been built on 2 qualities that most people mistook for weakness: patience and silence. I never made accusations until I had proof. I never revealed my hand until I was ready to win. Competitors had underestimated me throughout my career, interpreting my quiet demeanor as passivity. They learned otherwise, usually too late. Eleanor used to say I had the mind of a chess player. You don't see the board the way other people do, she told me once. You see 12 moves ahead, and you never let anyone know what you're planning until the checkmate is already inevitable. I had stopped playing chess when I retired. I had stopped thinking strategically about anything except how to survive each day without her. Tonight, sitting at her desk surrounded by the remnants of her life, I began to think like that man again. They thought my silence meant defeat. They did not know it was the first move in a game Eleanor had taught me to play long before she left this world. 3 days passed before they made their next move. I spent that time in deliberate stillness, maintaining my routine as if nothing had changed. I watered Eleanor's garden each morning. I read the newspaper on the back porch. I answered the phone when neighbors called to chat, keeping my voice steady and unremarkable. To anyone watching, I was simply an old widower moving through the quiet motions of retirement. But beneath that surface, my mind was working the way it had during my years in corporate finance, sifting through data, identifying patterns, waiting for the opposition to reveal their strategy. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in the kitchen making lunch when Ethan's name appeared on my phone screen. I let it ring 3 times before answering, keeping my voice mild and slightly tired. "Hello, son. Dad. We need to talk about something important." Ethan's tone was businesslike, rehearsed in a way that immediately put me on alert. I heard movement in the background, a door closing, and then a woman's voice murmuring something I could not quite make out. Vanessa was there, listening, perhaps coaching. "Of course," I said. "What's on your mind?" "It's about your finances, your accounts, the house, your investments." He paused, and I heard that murmur again, more distinct this time. Vanessa was feeding him lines. "We think it would be best if you signed a financial power of attorney, just for family management purposes. It would make things easier for everyone." I said nothing for a long moment, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. In negotiations, silence is a weapon. People rush to fill empty space, and in that rush, they often reveal more than they intended. Ethan took the bait. "Look, Dad, Vanessa says it's better if we handle your accounts before, things get worse. You've been confused lately. We all saw it at the party. This is just about protecting you." "Protecting me," I repeated, keeping my voice neutral. "Yes, and protecting the family assets. You worked hard for everything you have. We just want to make sure nothing happens to it because of any mistakes you might make." There it was, the true motive, barely concealed beneath the language of concern. They did not want to protect me. They wanted to control me. A financial power of attorney would give them access to every account I owned, every investment Eleanor and I had built over 45 years of marriage. They could make decisions without my consent, move money without my knowledge. And if they later decided to pursue guardianship, having control of my finances would make their case significantly stronger. I continued to play the role they expected. "I don't know, Ethan. That sounds like a big decision. Let me think about it. What's there to think about? His voice sharpened with frustration, and again I heard Vanessa's murmur in the background. He took a breath, clearly being instructed to stay calm. Dad, this is what families do. Vanessa's been through something like this before. Her first marriage was a mistake she doesn't like to talk about, but she learned a lot about protecting family interests. She knows what she's doing. I nearly missed it. The words slipped out so casually, buried in the flow of his argument, that a less attentive listener might have let them pass without notice. But I had spent 4 decades listening for exactly these kinds of slips, the small revelations that change everything. Her first marriage? In 20 years, Vanessa had never once mentioned being married before Ethan. Not at holiday dinners, not in casual conversation, not even when Eleanor had directly asked about her past. She had always presented herself as a woman whose life began when she met my son. Now, in his eagerness to pressure me, Ethan had revealed a secret his wife had kept hidden for 2 decades. I filed the information away without comment. I'll think about it, I said again. These things shouldn't be rushed. Ethan tried to push further, but I remained vague and non-committal until he finally gave up. When the call ended, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, turning this new piece of information over in my mind. What else had Vanessa hidden? What had happened in that first marriage that she worked so hard to keep buried? That night, I returned to Eleanor's study. I had been spending more time there since the party, finding comfort in the space where she had spent her final months. But tonight, I was not seeking comfort. I was searching. Eleanor had said everything I needed was where it had always been. I had assumed she meant the obvious things, the documents any spouse would leave behind. But Eleanor was never obvious. She thought in layers, in contingencies, in moves planned years in advance. I opened the bottom drawer of her desk, the one she had always kept locked. The key had been in her jewelry box, and I had never thought to use it until now. Inside, beneath old letters and photographs from our early years together, I found a sealed envelope. The handwriting on the front was Eleanor's, elegant and precise, despite the tremor that illness had brought to her hands in those final months. The words stopped my breath. Open when you're ready to fight back. My hands trembled as I broke the seal. Inside were 3 items. The first was a letter, several pages long, written in Eleanor's careful script. The second was a business card for someone named Margaret Hill, attorney at law, with a handwritten note on the back. My oldest friend. Trust her completely. The third item made me sit down heavily in Eleanor's chair. It was a photograph. Vanessa, clearly recognizable despite the image being several years old, sitting at a cafe table across from a man I had never seen. They were leaning toward each other with the intimacy of people sharing secrets. On the back, Eleanor had written a date and a single sentence. She meets him every month. Find out who he is. My wife had been dead for 2 years, but somehow she had known exactly what would happen, and she had left me a weapon I did not know existed. I sat at Eleanor's desk for nearly an hour before I found the courage to read her letter. The photograph lay face down beside me, that image of Vanessa with the unknown man too disturbing to look at twice. The business card for Margaret Hill rested beneath my fingertips, a lifeline I was not yet ready to grasp. But the letter demanded attention. Eleanor had written it knowing I would one day need its contents, and I owed her the respect of reading every word. My darling Richard, the letter began, and even after 2 years, seeing her handwriting made my chest ache with longing. If you're reading this, Vanessa has made her move. I saw it coming years before I got sick, perhaps even before you and I fully understood what kind of woman our son had married. I watched her isolate Ethan from his friends, from his colleagues, from us. I watched her study our finances with a focus that had nothing to do with household budgeting. I watched her test your boundaries, probe your weaknesses, and calculate your value. She is not what she appears to be, Richard. She never was. I wanted to tell you everything while I still could. But I knew you would confront her directly, and direct confrontation is exactly what she would expect. Vanessa is prepared for anger. She is prepared for accusations. What she is not prepared for is patience. What she does not understand is strategic silence. These are your greatest weapons, my love. Use them. Margaret has everything you need. She has been my dearest friend since college, and she is the finest estate attorney I have ever known. I went to her 3 months ago with my concerns, and together we built something that Vanessa cannot easily dismantle. Trust Margaret as you trusted me. She will guide you through what comes next. And Richard, find out who the man in the photograph is. I have watched Vanessa meet with him on the first Tuesday of every month for the past 3 years. She tells Ethan she is visiting her book club. She is lying. Whoever this man is, he is part of something she does not want anyone to discover. I am sorry I cannot be there to fight beside you, but I have done everything I could to fight for you from wherever I am going. Remember what I always told you. You have the mind of a chess player. It is time to use it. All my love, forever. Eleanor. I read the letter 3 times before I reached for Margaret Hill's business card. The handwritten note on the back, my oldest friend, trust her completely, steadied my resolve. It was nearly 10 o'clock at night, far too late for a phone call under normal circumstances. But nothing about this situation was normal, and I suspected Margaret had been waiting for this call for 2 years. She answered on the second ring. Richard Lawson. Her voice was warm but unsurprised. I wondered when I would hear from you. You knew Eleanor left me your card. I helped her write the letter. Margaret paused, and I heard the weight of memory in her silence. She came to me 3 months before she died. She had been watching Vanessa for years by then, documenting everything, building a case. She called what she left behind her insurance policy. I have kept it sealed and waiting, just as she asked. What's in it? That's not a conversation for the telephone, Richard. We should meet. Tomorrow, if you can manage it. My office is downtown, but I can come to you if that's easier. I'll come to you, I said. I need to get out of this house. Margaret gave me her address, and we agreed on 10 in the morning. Before I could hang up, she spoke again, her voice dropping to something more serious. Richard, I need to prepare you for what you're going to see. Eleanor didn't just suspect Vanessa was dangerous. She investigated her. Thoroughly. What do you mean? Your wife hired a private investigator. A good one. Someone who owed her a favor from years ago. He spent 6 months looking into Vanessa's background, her history, her connections. Margaret paused again. What he found, well, you need to see it yourself. Some things cannot be explained secondhand. The silence between us felt heavy with implication. I thought of the photograph, of Vanessa leaning toward that unknown man with such familiar intimacy. I thought of Ethan's slip about her first marriage, a marriage she had hidden for 20 years. I thought of all the small moments over 2 decades that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now arranged themselves into a pattern I could not yet fully see. Margaret, I said quietly, what am I walking into? Her response came slowly, each word chosen with care. Richard, your wife didn't just love you. She built you a fortress from beyond the grave. But what's inside that fortress might change everything you thought you knew about your family. Margaret Hill's office occupied the 3rd floor of a brick building downtown, the kind of modest professional space that suggested competence over flash. I arrived 15 minutes early and found her already waiting in the lobby, a silver-haired woman with sharp eyes and the confident posture of someone who had spent decades navigating courtrooms. She embraced me briefly, and in that gesture I felt echoes of Eleanor, of friendships that had spanned half a century. She talked about you constantly in those final months, Margaret said as she led me to her private office. Not with sadness, with purpose. She was determined to leave you protected. The file waited on her desk, thick and organized with the precision I recognized as Eleanor's handiwork. Margaret poured us both coffee and then sat across from me as I began to read. What I found inside made the coffee grow cold in my cup. Eleanor's private investigator had been thorough beyond anything I could have imagined. He had documented Vanessa's movements, her meetings, her communications where possible. But the most damning evidence came from something far more mundane. Her internet search history, obtained through methods I chose not to question. Page after page of screenshots showed Vanessa's research over the past 3 years. How to declare an elderly parent mentally incompetent. Controlling a spouse's estate through guardianship. Power of attorney versus conservatorship, which is stronger. Signs of dementia that courts accept as evidence. How long does the guardianship process take? She had been planning this for years. Long before Eleanor died. Long before the anniversary party. Vanessa had been methodically researching how to take legal control of my life, and she had done so with the patience of someone who understood that such schemes require careful groundwork. Margaret let me absorb the documents before she spoke. Richard, I need you to understand what she's attempting. This isn't just about money, though the money is certainly part of it. If Vanessa succeeds in having you declared mentally unfit, she and Ethan would become your legal guardians. They would control your bank accounts, your investments, your property, but it goes far beyond finances. She leaned forward, her expression grave. Guardianship means they decide where you live. They decide what medical treatment you receive. They can move you into a facility against your will. They can sell your home without your consent. They can cut you off from anyone they choose. Her voice softened. You would be alive, Richard, but you would be voiceless. Every decision about your existence would belong to them. The full scope of Vanessa's ambitions settled over me like a weight. I had assumed she wanted access to my accounts, perhaps control over the inheritance Ethan would eventually receive. I had not understood that she wanted to erase me entirely, to reduce me to a body that breathed while she pulled every string. I left Margaret's office with copies of the file and a mind churning with dark possibilities. The drive home felt longer than usual, every red light an opportunity for my thoughts to spiral further into anger and fear. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the afternoon had faded into early evening, and I wanted nothing more than silence and solitude to process what I had learned. Instead, I found Lily waiting on my front porch. My granddaughter stood as I approached, her expression caught between nervousness and determination. She was 19 years old, a sophomore at the state university, and until this moment I had assumed she was entirely under her mother's influence. Seeing her here, alone, without Vanessa's knowledge, shifted something in my understanding. "Grandpa, can we talk?" Her voice was steady despite the tension in her shoulders. "Inside, please. I don't want anyone to see me here." We sat in the living room, and I noticed immediately how tightly she gripped her phone, clutching it against her chest like a talisman. Her eyes moved to the windows twice, checking for observers. Whatever she had come to say, it frightened her. "I know Mom isn't who she pretends to be," Lily said finally. "I've known for a long time. I've been paying attention since Grandma died, watching how she treats you, listening to what she says when she thinks no one important can hear." She paused, swallowing hard. "Grandma Eleanor talked to me before she passed. She told me to watch carefully. She said someday you would need someone on the inside." I stared at my granddaughter, seeing for the first time the resemblance that went beyond physical features. She had Eleanor's eyes, that sharp and knowing gaze that cut through pretense to find the truth beneath. "What have you seen, Lily?" She lifted her phone slightly, that device she had been clutching so desperately since she arrived. "I've been collecting evidence," she whispered. "For 2 years, since the day of Grandma's funeral." Lily's revelation changed everything. We talked for 2 hours that evening, her voice dropping to a whisper whenever she shared details about her mother's behavior. She had witnessed conversations I never heard, observed manipulations I never saw, and recorded moments that Vanessa believed were private. But Lily was not ready to share those recordings yet. She needed to know I had protection first, legal armor that would shield us both when the truth finally emerged. I promised to call her after I met with Margaret again. That meeting came 2 days later, at the First National Bank on Morrison Street. Margaret had called that morning with urgency in her voice. "Eleanor left something else," she said. "A safe deposit box in both your names. She paid the rental 20 years in advance and left instructions that I should bring you there when the time was right." She paused. "Richard, I think the time is right." The bank's vault was cold and quiet, a place designed for secrets. A young manager led us to the private viewing room and placed a long metal box on the table between us. Margaret produced a key I had never seen, and I realized Eleanor must have given it to her during those final months when they were building whatever fortress awaited me inside. The box opened with a soft click. Inside lay a leather journal, thick with years of entries, alongside several manila envelopes and a stack of legal documents bound with a blue ribbon. Margaret gestured for me to begin with the journal, and I lifted it with hands that already trembled with anticipation. Eleanor had dated the first entry 5 years before her death. I recognized the period immediately. It was shortly after Ethan and Vanessa's 15th wedding anniversary, an event I remembered primarily because Vanessa had insisted on an extravagant party that had cost more than my son could reasonably afford. Eleanor had smiled through that celebration, but apparently she had been watching with far sharper eyes than I realized. The journal documented everything. Every manipulation, every lie, every calculated move Vanessa had made to isolate Ethan from his family and friends. Eleanor had recorded dates and quotes with the precision of a prosecutor building a case. She noted how Vanessa systematically criticized Ethan's childhood friends until he stopped seeing them. She documented the subtle ways Vanessa undermined our relationship with our son, always with plausible deniability, always with an innocent explanation ready. She tracked financial irregularities, social manipulations, and a pattern of control that spanned years. Page after page revealed a woman I thought I knew transformed into a stranger. Eleanor had seen the truth long before any of us, and she had documented it with meticulous care while pretending everything was normal. Margaret touched my arm gently. There's more. The legal documents. I set the journal aside and reached for the bound stack of papers. What I found there made the journal pale in comparison. 6 months before her death, while she was already weakened by chemotherapy, Eleanor had secretly restructured our entire estate. Working with Margaret, she had created a living trust with a level of sophistication I had never anticipated. She was brilliant, Margaret said quietly. She understood exactly what Vanessa would try, and she built walls that cannot be easily breached. The trust document named me as sole trustee of all our assets. The house, the investments, the savings accounts, everything Eleanor and I had built together over 45 years was now protected within a legal structure that Vanessa could not touch. Ethan remained a beneficiary, but he could only inherit under 2 conditions: if I voluntarily transferred assets to him or after my natural death. There was no mechanism for him or anyone else to force a transfer. No guardianship claim could circumvent the trust's protections. But the most powerful provision was the no contest clause. Margaret explained it carefully. If anyone challenges your mental competency in an attempt to gain control of the trust, and that challenge fails, they automatically forfeit all inheritance rights. Permanently. No appeals, no second chances. She met my eyes. Vanessa cannot file for guardianship without risking everything Ethan stands to inherit. Your wife created a trap that punishes exactly the kind of attack Vanessa has been planning. I returned to the journal, overwhelmed by the scope of Eleanor's foresight. Near the end, I found the final entry, written in handwriting, that had grown shaky with illness. The date was 1 week before she died. I tried to warn Ethan, she had written. I sat him down and told him everything I suspected about Vanessa. I showed him some of what I had documented. He accused me of being paranoid. He said I was jealous of his happiness, that I had never accepted his wife. He chose her over truth, over his own mother's dying words. So I am choosing to protect Richard instead. I cannot save my son from his own blindness, but I can save my husband from its consequences. Some lessons can only be learned the hard way. I pray Ethan learns his before it destroys him completely. My hands trembled as I closed the journal. The magnitude of what Eleanor had done pressed against my chest like a physical weight. She had spent her final months, while cancer consumed her body, waging a silent war to protect me. She had anticipated attacks I never saw coming and built defenses I never knew existed. She had loved me not just with words and presence, but with strategy and sacrifice. Margaret reached across the table and pointed to a page I had not yet examined, marked with a small red tab. There's more, Richard. The investigator's report, the one Eleanor commissioned, he found something about Vanessa's past. Her voice dropped. Something she's been hiding for 15 years. Margaret would not show me the investigator's full report that day. She insisted I needed time to process what I had already learned, and perhaps she was right. The revelations about Eleanor's preparations, about the trust and its protections, about the journal documenting years of manipulation, had left me exhausted in ways that sleep could not remedy. But more than that, I found myself thinking about Ethan, about the son I had raised, the boy who had once looked at me with uncomplicated adoration, and the man he had become under Vanessa's influence. Eleanor's final journal entry haunted me. She had tried to warn him, she had shown him evidence, and he had chosen his wife over his dying mother's words. I needed to see for myself whether anything remained of the son I remembered. I called Ethan the following Monday and invited him to lunch. Just the 2 of us, I said, father and son. He hesitated long enough that I knew he was checking with Vanessa, but eventually he agreed. We arranged to meet at a quiet restaurant near his office, a place we had visited together years ago when our relationship still resembled something healthy. He was already seated when I arrived, and I noticed immediately that he had brought a folder. The sight of it confirmed what I had suspected. This would not be a reconciliation lunch. This would be another attempt to pressure me into signing away my autonomy. Ethan stood to greet me with a handshake rather than an embrace, and even that small detail spoke volumes about the distance between us. We ordered food neither of us would finish and made small talk about weather and sports until the server retreated. Then Ethan opened his folder and began to speak in a tone I recognized from every corporate presentation I had ever endured. "Dad, I've been thinking a lot about family responsibility lately, about what it means to take care of the people we love, especially as they get older." He glanced at his notes, and I saw bullet points written in handwriting that was not his own. Vanessa had prepared this speech for him, probably rehearsed it with him the night before. "Your health has been a concern for all of us. The confusion at the party, the forgetfulness, the way you've been isolating yourself since Mom died. These are signs that we can't ignore." I said nothing. I simply watched him deliver lines that had been crafted to sound caring while laying groundwork for something far more sinister. "We've consulted with some professionals," Ethan continued, "and they agree that early intervention is important. If we put the right structures in place now, while you're still capable of participating in the decisions, it protects everyone. The power of attorney we discussed would just be a first step, a way to make sure your affairs are handled properly if anything happens." "If anything happens," I repeated quietly. "What exactly do you think is going to happen, Ethan?" He faltered, just slightly, before recovering. "You know what I mean, Dad. You're 68 years old. Mom's death hit you hard. It's natural for there to be some decline. I've had no decline. I kept my voice calm, almost gentle. My mind is as sharp as it's ever been. I manage my own finances, maintain my own home, and handle every aspect of my life without assistance. The only confusion at that party was my confusion about why my own son seated me next to the kitchen and then refused to let me offer a simple toast." Something shifted in Ethan's expression. The rehearsed patience began to crack. "That's exactly what I'm talking about. You're being paranoid. You're seeing conspiracies where there's only concern. I'm not signing anything, Ethan." The words landed between us like stones dropped into still water. I watched the ripples spread across my son's face, watched the mask slip further as frustration overtook the careful script his wife had written. "You're not the man you used to be," Ethan said, his voice hardening. "The father I grew up with was reasonable. He listened to his family. He trusted us to help him when he needed it." He leaned forward, and for a moment I saw something ugly flash behind his eyes, something that looked like Vanessa's influence given voice. "Mom would be ashamed of how stubborn you've become." The words cut deeper than any accusation about my mental state. To invoke Eleanor, to use her memory as a weapon against me, was a cruelty I had not anticipated even from the stranger my son had become. I absorbed the pain without letting it show on my face. 42 years in corporate finance had taught me to receive devastating news with composure, and I drew on every ounce of that training now. But even as I absorbed the blow, I saw something else. A flicker of doubt crossed Ethan's face, there and gone so quickly that someone who did not know him might have missed it entirely. For just an instant, he looked uncertain, almost ashamed. The boy I had raised, the child who had once climbed into my lap and asked me to explain how airplanes stayed up, was still in there somewhere. Vanessa had buried him under 20 years of manipulation and control, but she had not entirely extinguished him. Eleanor's words from the journal returned to me. "Ethan isn't evil. He's weak. Vanessa found his weakness and built her nest inside it. Don't hate him, Richard. Save him if you can, but protect yourself first." I reached for my coffee and took a slow sip before responding. "Your mother knew me better than anyone who has ever lived, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that she would not be ashamed of me for protecting myself from people who wish me harm." Ethan's jaw tightened. "If you won't listen to reason, there are other options. Legal options. Ways to make sure you're taken care of whether you agree or not." He gathered his folder and stood, the lunch untouched on his plate. "I didn't want it to come to this, Dad, but you're not giving us a choice." He left without another word, and I sat alone at the table long after his car had disappeared from the parking lot. As my son drove away, I did not feel the anger I expected. I felt grief, the kind that comes from watching someone you love become a stranger. Somewhere inside that man was still the boy who used to hold my hand crossing the street. But Vanessa had buried him so deep, I wondered if anyone could dig him out. Lily texted me 3 days after my disastrous lunch with Ethan. She asked to meet somewhere private, somewhere her mother would not think to look. I suggested the small cafe on Birchwood Avenue, a place Eleanor and I used to visit on Sunday mornings. It was far enough from Vanessa's usual circles that we could speak freely, and quiet enough that we would notice if anyone tried to listen. She arrived 20 minutes early, and I found her seated in the back corner with a clear view of both the entrance and the parking lot. When I approached the table, she stood quickly and embraced me, then glanced toward the window before sitting down again. Throughout our entire conversation, she checked the door at least half a dozen times. Whatever she planned to tell me had her frightened in ways I had never seen from my normally confident granddaughter. "Thank you for coming, Grandpa." Her voice was barely above a whisper despite the empty tables around us. "I need to tell you something I've never told anyone, about why I started watching Mom, about what I heard." I reached across the table and took her hand. "I'm listening." Lily closed her eyes briefly, as if gathering strength from some internal reserve. The day of Grandma's funeral. After the service, when everyone was at the house eating and talking, I went upstairs to be alone for a while because I couldn't stop crying, and I heard Mom in the guest bedroom making a phone call. She opened her eyes, and I saw the hardness there, the determination that had calcified around an old wound. She was laughing. "Grandpa." Grandma had been in the ground for 3 hours, and Mom was laughing. My stomach tightened. What did she say? She said, "Finally, the old woman is gone. Now we can really get started." Lily's grip on my hand tightened. I was 17 years old. I was standing in the hallway crying for my grandmother, and I heard my mother celebrate her death like it was a business opportunity. I'll never forget those words. Never. The cafe suddenly felt colder despite the warm afternoon light streaming through the windows. I thought of Eleanor's final months, how Vanessa had visited regularly, bringing flowers and offering to help with household tasks. I had thought she was being kind. Now I understood she had been circling, waiting, counting down the days until her obstacle was removed. "What did you do?" I asked quietly. At first, nothing. I didn't know what to do. But then I remembered something Grandma told me a few weeks before she died. Lily released my hand and reached into her bag, pulling out a small leather notebook I recognized immediately. It was similar to the journal from the safe deposit box, but smaller, more personal. She kept this in her nightstand. I found it a month after the funeral, when I was looking for something to remember her by. She slid the notebook across the table to me. I opened it carefully, and Eleanor's handwriting filled the pages like a voice from beyond. Near the end, one passage had been underlined in red ink. "If anything happens to me, watch Vanessa. Document everything. Trust no one in that house except Lily. She has my eyes and my instincts. When the time comes, she will know what to do." I looked up at my granddaughter with new understanding. Eleanor had recruited her, had seen in Lily the same sharp perception that had defined her own character. My wife had known she was dying, had known Vanessa would move against me, and had placed a sentinel in the enemy's own household. "So I followed her instructions," Lily continued. "I watched, I documented. I paid attention to every conversation, every phone call, every meeting Mom thought was private." She paused, something shifting in her expression. "Grandpa, I need to ask you something about the law." "Go ahead." "One-party consent for recording conversations. I've looked it up online, but I want to make sure I understand correctly. In our state, if I'm part of a conversation, I can record it without telling the other person, right?" I felt the first stirrings of hope I had experienced since this nightmare began. My years as CFO had required extensive knowledge of legal matters, including the intricacies of evidence gathering. That's correct. In this state, only one party to the conversation needs to consent to the recording. If you're a participant, you can legally record without informing others. Lily smiled, and in that smile I saw Eleanor's quiet triumph when a plan came together. That's what I thought. "Why do you ask?" Instead of answering directly, she mentioned something that seemed unrelated. "Do you remember Grace Bennett, the older woman who lives 3 houses down from you? She came to Grandma's funeral, stayed for a while at the reception. I remember her. Why? She said something strange to me once, about a year ago. We were chatting on your front lawn, and Mom drove by without stopping. Grace watched the car and said, 'That woman looks exactly like someone I saw on the news years ago. Something about a family in Ohio.' She couldn't remember the details, but it stuck with me. Ohio. The word connected to something Margaret had mentioned, something from the investigator's report she had not yet shown me. I filed the detail away, adding it to the growing pattern. Lily pulled out her phone and navigated to a folder labeled insurance. She turned the screen toward me, and I saw a list of audio files with dates spanning 2 years. "Grandpa," she said quietly, "I have 47 recordings. Every conversation where Mom talked about her plans, every lie she told Dad about you, every time she discussed what to do about the old man." She paused, scrolling to a specific file near the bottom of the list. "And there's one recording where she talks about what happened to her first husband's father. He lost everything. No one believed him until it was too late." The name Grace Bennett stayed with me long after Lily and I parted ways at the cafe. She had mentioned it almost in passing, a detail embedded among far more explosive revelations. But something about the connection nagged at me through the night and into the following morning. A woman who remembered something from the news, a case in Ohio, a face that looked familiar. I decided to pay Grace a visit. She lived 3 houses down from me in a modest Victorian that her late husband had lovingly restored over several decades. I had known Grace and her husband since Eleanor and I moved into the neighborhood 30 years ago, though our interactions had always been limited to friendly waves and occasional conversations over the fence. What I remembered most about Grace was her career. She had worked as a head librarian at the county library for 40 years, a profession that demanded organization, attention to detail, and an exceptional memory for information. If anyone could remember a news story from 15 years ago with accuracy, it would be her. She answered the door with the warm but cautious smile of someone who was not expecting visitors. When she saw it was me, her expression shifted to something more complex, a mixture of concern and what I could only describe as anticipation. "Richard Lawson, I was wondering when you would come." She stepped aside to let me in. "I suppose this is about Vanessa." The directness of her statement caught me off guard. "How did you know?" "Because I've been waiting to have this conversation for 20 years. She led me to her sitting room, a space filled with books and photographs and the comfortable clutter of a life well lived. "Please, sit down. Can I make you some tea?" I declined the tea but accepted the seat. Grace settled into the armchair across from me and studied my face with eyes that were remarkably sharp for a woman of 71. I understood in that moment why she had been such an effective librarian. Nothing escaped her attention. "Your granddaughter mentioned you recognized Vanessa from somewhere," I began. "From something you saw on the news." Grace nodded slowly. "That woman. I've been trying to place her face for 20 years, ever since your son brought her home. There was always something familiar about her, something I couldn't quite grasp. Then it came to me last month, clear as day." She leaned forward slightly. "Ohio. About 15 years ago. There was a case all over the local news. I was visiting my sister in Columbus at the time, and the story was everywhere for weeks." "What kind of case?" "A family accused a young woman of manipulating their elderly father." Grace's voice took on the precise cadence of someone reciting facts she had committed to memory. "The woman had married the son, just like Vanessa married Ethan. She systematically isolated the old man from his friends, from other family members, from anyone who might have protected him. Then she began working to take control of his estate. Power of attorney at first, then guardianship proceedings. The family fought back, and eventually won. The case was settled out of court, and the woman disappeared. Changed her name, moved away, vanished completely. My heart was pounding, but I kept my voice steady. "And you think this woman was Vanessa?" "I don't think, Richard. I know." Grace rose and crossed to a cabinet where she retrieved a folder that looked recently assembled. After I made the connection, I spent 3 weeks at the library digging through archives. The Columbus Dispatch covered the story extensively. I found photographs. She handed me the folder. "The quality isn't perfect, but look at the face. Look at the eyes. It's the same woman, 15 years younger. I would stake my reputation on it." I opened the folder and found myself staring at a newspaper photograph of a young woman being escorted from a courthouse by an attorney. The image was grainy, the product of early digital printing, but the features were unmistakable. The shape of the face, the set of the jaw, the way she held herself with practiced composure under scrutiny. It was Vanessa. The photograph triggered another memory. The mysterious man in Eleanor's photograph, the one she met every month at the cafe. Could he be connected to Ohio? Could he be someone from that family, someone who had been tracking Vanessa all these years? I thanked Grace and drove directly to Margaret's office. She was between appointments, but made time for me immediately when she saw my expression. I laid the folder on her desk and told her everything Grace had shared. Margaret examined the materials with the careful attention of someone who understood their implications. "If this is true," she said quietly, "we're not dealing with simple greed. We're dealing with a pattern. A predator who has done this before and refined her methods. Can you investigate? Find out everything about Vanessa before she married Ethan? Any connections to Ohio? Any previous names she might have used?" "I can, and I will." Margaret closed the folder and looked at me with gravity. "Richard, if Vanessa has done this before, it changes everything. It means she's experienced at evading consequences. It means she knows exactly how to manipulate legal systems and family dynamics. It means the protections Eleanor put in place may be even more important than we realized." I thought of Lily's recordings, of the evidence slowly accumulating from multiple sources. Vanessa had built her current life on the assumption that her past was buried. She did not know that the walls were closing in from every direction. When I returned home that evening, Grace was standing in her front yard, watching me pull into the driveway. She walked over slowly, and when she reached me, her expression held something between pity and determination. "Richard," she said softly, "that woman didn't marry your son for love. She married your family's legacy. And if I'm right about Ohio, you're not her first victim, you're her second. Which means she's learned from her mistakes, and this time, she won't fail so easily." Grace's warning proved prophetic sooner than either of us expected. The call from Margaret came 3 days later, at 7 in the morning, her voice carrying an urgency I had not heard before. "Richard, she's made her move. Vanessa filed an emergency guardianship petition with the county court yesterday afternoon. The hearing is scheduled for 2 weeks from today." I sat down heavily at the kitchen table, the phone pressed against my ear. Despite everything I had learned, despite all the preparation, the reality of legal action still landed like a blow. On what grounds? The petition claims you exhibit signs of cognitive decline, inability to manage your personal and financial affairs, and potential danger to yourself. Margaret's tone was clipped, professional, the voice of an attorney shifting into battle mode. She's included statements from Ethan describing your supposed confusion at the anniversary party, your isolation since Eleanor's death, and your refusal to accept family help. She's also submitted a letter from a doctor I've never heard of, suggesting you should be evaluated for early-stage dementia. I've never seen any doctor about dementia. I've never been evaluated for anything of the kind. I know. Which means either she fabricated the letter entirely, or she found a physician willing to write opinions about patients he's never examined. Either way, it's grounds for serious concern about her methods. Margaret paused. "We need to meet today, Richard. All of us. You, me, and Lily. It's time to show the court exactly who Vanessa Lawson really is." We gathered that afternoon in Margaret's conference room. Lily arrived with a laptop bag and an expression of grim determination that made her look far older than 19. She had dressed conservatively, as if already preparing for a courtroom appearance, and when she opened her laptop on the table between us, her hands were steady despite the gravity of the moment. 47 recordings, she said, navigating to a folder filled with audio files. Every conversation I captured over the past 2 years where Mom discussed her plans for Grandpa, her manipulation of Dad, or her intentions regarding the family finances. I've organized them chronologically and created a summary document, identifying the most significant admissions in each one. Margaret accepted the summary and began reviewing it with the focused attention of someone who had spent decades preparing legal strategies. I watched her expression shift as she read, her eyebrows rising at certain passages, her jaw tightening at others. "Play number 12, she said. Lily clicked the file, and Vanessa's voice filled the room. She was speaking to someone, a friend perhaps, her tone casual and confident. "The old man won't last long. Once we get guardianship, we control everything. His accounts, his house, his medical decisions. Ethan doesn't have the spine to question me. He'll sign whatever I put in front of him, and Richard will spend his final years in whatever facility I choose." The recording ended. Margaret made a note and pointed to another entry on the summary, number 23. This recording captured Vanessa on the phone with Ethan, her voice shifting to the soft, manipulative tone I had heard her use countless times without recognizing it for what it was. Your father has never appreciated you, sweetheart. He always favored his work over his family. Remember how he missed your baseball games? Remember how he criticized your business plans? I just tell him you never felt loved enough, and it works every time. He's so guilty about the past that he can't see the present clearly. I listened to my daughter-in-law poison my son's memories, rewriting our shared history into a narrative of neglect and failure. The manipulation was so precise, so deliberate, that I understood for the first time how completely she had captured Ethan. She had not just isolated him from me, she had convinced him that isolation was justified, even necessary. Margaret pointed to one more entry. Number 43. Lily flagged this as significant, but I don't think she understood just how significant until now. The recording was different from the others. Vanessa's voice was lower, more guarded, as if she suspected someone might be listening. She was on the phone with someone whose voice I could not identify, speaking in the clipped sentences of someone discussing confidential matters. I've done this before, you know. My first husband's father thought he was smart too, thought he could protect his assets with trusts and lawyers and family loyalty. By the time I was done, he couldn't even buy groceries without my permission. The son believed every word I told him, just like Ethan does now. It's almost too easy once you understand how guilt works. The recording continued for another minute, but I had stopped processing the words. Vanessa had confessed. She had admitted, in her own voice, to a pattern of predatory behavior spanning at least 2 families and 15 years. Lily had captured a confession without realizing its full significance. A piece of evidence that connected everything Grace had told me, everything the Ohio News Archives had documented, everything Eleanor had suspected. I stared at my granddaughter, this 19-year-old girl who had spent 2 years building a case that professional investigators could not match. She had followed her grandmother's instructions with a dedication that bordered on reverence, watching and documenting and waiting for the moment when the truth would matter. Eleanor had seen something in Lily that I had overlooked, a sharpness and determination that matched her own. Lily, I said slowly, you didn't just save me. You might have caught a serial predator. Margaret was already reaching for her phone, her expression a mixture of professional excitement and moral outrage. I need to call my contact at the Ohio State Bar. If there's a pattern here, Vanessa isn't just facing a failed guardianship claim. She's facing criminal exposure. The 2 weeks before the hearing passed, in a blur of preparation, Margaret arranged for an independent psychiatric evaluation with Dr. Samuel Reeves, a respected neuropsychologist who had testified in dozens of competency cases and whose reputation for thoroughness made him virtually unimpeachable. If anyone attempted to challenge his findings, they would be questioning one of the most credentialed experts in the state. The evaluation took place on a Wednesday morning in Dr. Reeves' clinical office. For 3 hours, I submitted to every test he could devise, memory assessments that required me to recall lists of words, sequences of numbers, and details from stories read aloud, reasoning exercises that demanded I identify patterns, solve problems, and explain my thought processes, financial comprehension tests where I analyzed mock investment portfolios and identified errors in accounting statements, daily living assessments that examined my ability to manage medications, appointments, household tasks, and personal care. I approached each test with the same focus I had brought to my career. 42 years as a chief financial officer had trained my mind for exactly this kind of rigorous analysis, and I felt the rust of retirement falling away as I worked through problem after problem. By the end of the 3 hours, I was tired but confident. Dr. Reeves removed his glasses and looked at me with something approaching admiration. Mr. Lawson, I've administered this battery of tests to hundreds of patients over my career. Your results place you in the top percentile for cognitive function among adults your age. Your memory is excellent, your reasoning is sharp, and your financial comprehension exceeds what I typically see from practicing professionals. He shook his head slowly. There is absolutely no evidence of impairment. Whoever filed this guardianship petition was either badly misinformed about your condition or deliberately lying to the court. The hearing arrived on a cold Tuesday morning. I dressed in my best suit, the charcoal one Eleanor had helped me choose for important meetings, and met Margaret at the courthouse 30 minutes early. She carried a briefcase filled with evidence we had assembled over the past weeks. The psychiatric evaluation, my personal financial records, tax returns I had prepared myself without any professional assistance, and documentation of my daily activities that demonstrated complete independence. Vanessa and Ethan were already seated at the petitioner's table when we entered the courtroom. Vanessa wore an expression of confident concern, the mask of a devoted daughter-in-law worried about her aging father-in-law's welfare. Ethan sat beside her, looking uncomfortable, his eyes avoiding mine as I took my place at the respondent's table. I wondered if some part of him recognized the wrongness of what they were attempting, or if Vanessa had so thoroughly captured his mind that doubt no longer had room to grow. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s named Patricia Holloway, reviewed the petitions and responses with the efficiency of someone who had presided over countless such hearings. She allowed Vanessa's attorney to present their case first. He spoke of my alleged confusion at the anniversary party, my supposed isolation and erratic behavior, the letter from a doctor recommending evaluation. He painted a picture of a declining old man too proud to accept the help he desperately needed. Then Margaret rose to respond. She began with Dr. Reeves's evaluation, reading key passages aloud and submitting the complete report as evidence. She presented my financial records, showing years of meticulous management without a single error or oversight. She submitted copies of the tax returns I had prepared personally, complex documents that required the kind of cognitive function incompatible with the decline Vanessa had alleged. She provided statements from neighbors, from my accountant, from my primary care physician, all attesting to my sharp mind and complete independence. The contrast between the two presentations was devastating. Vanessa's attorney had offered vague allegations in a suspicious medical letter. Margaret had provided concrete, documented, expert-verified proof that those allegations were false. Judge Holloway reviewed the evidence for several minutes in silence. When she looked up, her expression had hardened into something close to contempt. "I am dismissing this petition," she announced. "The petitioners have provided a troubling lack of evidence to support their claims, while the respondent has demonstrated beyond any reasonable doubt that he is mentally competent and fully capable of managing his own affairs." She turned her gaze directly toward Vanessa. "I will note for the record that filing frivolous guardianship petitions constitutes a serious abuse of court resources. I strongly advise the petitioners to reconsider any future actions of this nature." The gavel fell. The hearing had lasted less than 15 minutes. I watched Vanessa's confident mask crack for the first time in 20 years. Her attorney whispered something urgent, but she was not listening. Her eyes were fixed on Margaret, who had risen and was approaching the petitioner's table with a document in hand. "Mrs. Lawson," Margaret said formally, "I am required to notify you that by filing this competency challenge against Richard Lawson, you have triggered the no contest clause contained in the Eleanor Lawson Family Trust." She placed the document on the table. "This clause states that any beneficiary who challenges the trustee's mental competency and fails in that challenge automatically forfeits all inheritance rights. You and your husband are now under review for permanent disinheritance from the trust." Vanessa's face went pale. For a moment, she looked like a woman watching her carefully constructed world collapse around her. This was not in her playbook. She had expected a confused old man, an easy victory, an uncontested path to control. She had not expected Eleanor. The phone call came that night, just before 10 o'clock. Vanessa's voice was sharp with panic, stripped of the polished composure she had maintained for 2 decades. "What did you do?" she demanded. "What the hell did you do?" I let the silence stretch, savoring the reversal of power. Then I answered calmly, each word deliberate. "I didn't do anything, Vanessa. My wife did. 2 years ago, from her deathbed, Eleanor saw exactly who you are, and she's not finished with you yet." The aftermath of the court hearing rippled through my family in ways I had anticipated but taken no pleasure in predicting. Within 48 hours of the dismissal, Margaret sent formal letters to both Ethan and Vanessa, notifying them that all voluntary financial support from the Eleanor Lawson Family Trust would cease immediately pending the outcome of the disinheritance review. For 20 years, I had been quietly subsidizing my son's life. The remaining balance on their mortgage, nearly $1,200 each month, had been paid from an account I maintained specifically for that purpose. Lily's college tuition, room, and board, another significant sum, came from the same source. And when Ethan's consulting business struggled, as it frequently did, I supplemented his income without comment or condition. I had done these things out of love, asking nothing in return except the hope that my son would find his footing and that my granddaughter would have every opportunity to succeed. Now that support was gone. I did not know the details of the financial crisis that followed, but I could imagine it clearly enough. Vanessa had built their lifestyle on the assumption that my money would always flow. Without it, the careful facade of prosperity she had constructed would begin to crumble. Bills would go unpaid. Credit would tighten. The comfortable existence she had orchestrated would reveal itself as the illusion it had always been. Ethan appeared at my door 5 days after the hearing, alone for the first time in months. Vanessa was nowhere in sight, and the absence of her influence was visible in every aspect of his demeanor. He looked exhausted, confused, diminished in ways that went beyond simple fatigue. The confident man who had threatened me with legal options over lunch had been replaced by someone I almost recognized. Someone who resembled the uncertain boy I had raised before Vanessa had reshaped him. "Can I come in?" His voice was hoarse, stripped of its usual careful modulation. I stepped aside without speaking and led him to the living room where Eleanor's photograph still held pride of place above the fireplace. Ethan stood before it for a long moment, staring at his mother's face, before turning to me with questions written across his features. "Dad, did Mom really change everything? The trust, the will, all of it?" He spread his hands in a gesture of helpless confusion. "Vanessa says there must be some mistake, that Mom wouldn't have done something so extreme without telling us. But Margaret's letters are very specific, and the judge, the way she dismissed our petition, like we were lying about everything." I settled into my chair and considered my son carefully. He was 45 years old, a grown man who had made choices for 2 decades that had led him to this moment. Part of me wanted to comfort him, to smooth over the pain he was obviously experiencing. But Eleanor's voice echoed in my memory, reminding me that some lessons could only be learned the hard way. "Your mother loved you, Ethan, more than you will ever know. But she loved truth more." I let the words settle between us before continuing. "She gave you 20 years to see what Vanessa really is. She dropped hints. She asked questions. She tried to warn you directly at the end, when she was dying and had nothing left to lose. You chose not to look. You called her paranoid, jealous, confused by medication. You chose your wife over your mother's dying words." Ethan flinched as if I had struck him. "That's not fair. I didn't know. How could I have known? You could have listened. You could have asked questions instead of dismissing them. You could have trusted the woman who had never lied to you in 45 years over the woman you had known for 20. I shook my head slowly. "But that's not what you did. And now you're standing in my living room asking me to explain why your mother protected me from the people who were trying to take everything I have." He had no answer. He stood in silence for what felt like minutes, his eyes moving between Eleanor's photograph and my face, searching for something I could not give him. Then he left without another word, and I watched his car disappear down the street with a heaviness in my chest that felt like grief. The call came at midnight. I was not asleep. Sleep had become unreliable since the anniversary party, my mind too active with strategies and revelations to rest properly. When I saw Ethan's name on the phone screen, I answered without hesitation. "Dad." His voice was raw, torn open by something I could not immediately identify. I found Mom's journal, not the legal one, the other one, the personal one she kept in the box with her wedding dress. I said nothing. I waited. She wrote about Vanessa, about how Vanessa would isolate me from my friends, make me feel guilty for spending time with anyone but her, how she would twist my words, repeat things back to me in ways that made me doubt my own memory. His breath came in shudders. She documented how Vanessa created fights between you and me, how she would tell me you said things you never said, how she convinced me you never respected my choices. I closed my eyes and listened to my son's voice crack and reform, as 45 years of certainty collapsed around him. "Dad, there are entries going back 15 years. Mom saw everything. She saw what was happening to me, to our family, and she wrote it all down because she knew someday I would need to understand." He made a sound that might have been a sob, and I called her crazy. When she tried to warn me, I told her she was jealous of my happiness. I said horrible things to her, Dad, while she was dying. I said horrible things to my mother while she was dying. His voice broke completely. "What have I done?" Ethan arrived at my door the following morning looking like a man who had not slept in days. His clothes were rumpled, his face unshaven, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. He clutched Eleanor's journal against his chest like a lifeline, that leather-bound record of his mother's observations that had shattered the world he thought he knew. I stepped aside to let him in, and he walked past me into the living room as if moving through water, each step requiring conscious effort. He did not sit down. Instead, he stood before Eleanor's photograph again, holding the journal open to a page marked with a torn piece of paper. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Listen to this, Dad. From 15 years ago, right after Lily was born," he cleared his throat and began to read. "Ethan came to dinner alone tonight. He said Vanessa was tired from caring for the baby, but I suspect she simply didn't want him spending time with us without her supervision. He mentioned that he hasn't seen his college friends in months. When I asked why, he said Vanessa thought they were a bad influence. One by one, she is cutting away everyone who knew him before her. Soon there will be no one left who remembers the man he used to be." Ethan turned to another marked page. This one is from 12 years ago. Richard tried to give Ethan advice about his business today, and Ethan became defensive immediately. He accused Richard of never believing in him, of always criticizing his choices. I know Richard said nothing of the kind. I was in the next room and heard every word. But when I tried to explain, Ethan looked at me like I was the enemy. Vanessa has convinced him that his father is cold and controlling. She has rewritten his childhood memories to support a narrative that serves only her. He read passage after passage, each one documenting another thread of the web Vanessa had woven around him. Eleanor had watched her son disappear into his wife's control with the anguish of someone witnessing a slow drowning. She had noted how Vanessa created emergencies whenever Ethan planned to visit his parents, how she manufactured conflicts that required his immediate attention, how she slowly convinced him that his own family could not be trusted. When Ethan finally closed the journal, his hands were trembling. "I thought I was lucky," he whispered, "to have someone who cared about me so much, who wanted to be with me all the time, who was so invested in every aspect of my life." He looked at me with devastation written across his features. "I didn't see the cage, Dad. I thought the bars were protection." I remained silent, letting him continue at his own pace. There was more he needed to say, more confessions that had been building behind the dam of his denial for 20 years. "She made me promise never to tell anyone about her first marriage," Ethan said. "Right after we got engaged, she sat me down and told me about this man she had married when she was young. She said he was abusive, that he had controlled every aspect of her life, that she had to change her name and move across the country to escape him. She made it sound so traumatic, and I felt honored that she trusted me with something so painful." He laughed bitterly. "I protected her secret. For 20 years, I protected her secret because I believed I was protecting her." He set the journal on the coffee table and sank into the chair across from me, his body folding in on itself like a man who had lost the will to remain upright. 3 weeks before Mom died, she asked to speak with me privately. She was so weak by then, could barely sit up in bed, but her mind was still sharp. His voice cracked. "She begged me, Dad. She begged me to hire a private investigator to look into Vanessa's past. She said there was something wrong, something Vanessa was hiding, something that could hurt all of us." He covered his face with his hands. I refused. I told her she was being paranoid. I accused her of never accepting my marriage, of being jealous that another woman had my loyalty. Those were almost the last words I ever said to my mother. I dismissed her dying warning as the ravings of a jealous old woman. The silence that followed was heavy with 20 years of regret. I watched my son struggle with the weight of his choices, and I felt the familiar tension between wanting to comfort him and knowing that comfort without truth would only perpetuate the patterns that had brought us here. "Ethan," I said quietly, "a father's love doesn't come with conditions. It never did. Not when you were 5 years old and broke the window with a baseball. Not when you were 25 and chose to marry a woman your mother and I had reservations about. Not now." He looked up, tears streaming down his face, desperate for absolution. "I forgive you," I continued. "But forgiveness doesn't mean pretending nothing happened. It means choosing to move forward anyway, with open eyes and honest hearts. Trust takes time to rebuild. We have work ahead of us, work that will be painful and slow, but we can begin if you're willing." Ethan nodded slowly, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "There's something else, Dad." Something I should have told you 20 years ago." He pulled out his phone and navigated to his messages, then turned the screen toward me. It was a text from Vanessa, sent just yesterday, the words sharp with implied threat. "Remember what happened to my ex-father-in-law. Don't get any ideas about talking to your father." Ethan looked at me with fear in his eyes, the kind of fear that comes from realizing you have been living alongside a stranger. "Dad, what did she do to that man?" Margaret called the following afternoon with news that demanded an immediate meeting. Her voice carried a weight I had not heard before, something beyond professional concern, something that spoke to the gravity of what she had uncovered. She asked me to bring Ethan. Whatever she had found, she believed my son needed to hear it firsthand. We gathered in her conference room an hour later. Ethan sat beside me, his posture rigid with anxiety, still wearing the haunted expression of a man whose reality had been systematically dismantled. Margaret entered carrying a thick folder and a laptop, her movements deliberate and careful, the way someone handles evidence that will change lives. "I completed my investigation this morning," she began, settling into her chair across from us. "With help from contacts at the Ohio State Bar and a retired colleague who practices family law in Columbus, what I found is worse than any of us imagined." She opened the folder and spread several documents across the table. Court filings, newspaper clippings, photographs, all bearing dates from 15 years ago. 15 years before she met your family, Vanessa was living in Ohio under her first name, Victoria. She married a man named Daniel Hartwell, the only son of a successful real estate developer named Robert Hartwell. The father was 63 years old at the time of the marriage, recently widowed, and possessed an estate worth several $1,000,000. I watched Ethan's face as Margaret continued. He was listening with the intensity of someone hearing his own history rewritten. "Victoria followed the exact same playbook she used with your family. She isolated Daniel from his father through systematic manipulation. She convinced him that Robert was controlling, that he disapproved of the marriage, that he wanted to interfere with their happiness. Within 2 years, Daniel had almost completely severed his relationship with his father. Then Victoria began the second phase. Margaret slid a court document toward us. She filed for emergency guardianship of Robert Hartwell, claiming he showed signs of dementia and was incapable of managing his affairs. The petition was nearly identical to the one she filed against you, Richard. The same language, the same allegations, the same strategy." Ethan made a sound that might have been a gasp or a sob. He was seeing the pattern now, seeing how thoroughly he had been deceived. "The Hartwell family fought back," Margaret continued. "Robert's brother was an attorney, and he recognized immediately what Victoria was attempting. They hired investigators, gathered evidence, and defeated the guardianship petition. But here's where it gets complicated. Rather than face criminal charges and public exposure, Victoria negotiated a settlement. She agreed to divorce Daniel, relinquish all claims to family assets, and leave Ohio permanently. In exchange, the court records were sealed, and the family agreed not to pursue prosecution. She pulled out a photograph, the same image Eleanor had captured years ago of Vanessa meeting a man at a cafe. This is William Crane. He was the lead attorney for the Hartwell family during the guardianship battle. I contacted him yesterday, and what he told me explains everything." Margaret pressed a button on her laptop, and a video conference window opened. A man in his 60s appeared on the screen, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, with the bearing of someone who had spent decades in courtrooms. "Mr. Lawson," William Crane said, his voice carrying clearly through the speakers, "I've been tracking Victoria, or Vanessa as she now calls herself, for 15 years. After the settlement, she changed her name, moved to another state, and waited for the attention to fade. I knew she would strike again. Predators like her don't stop. They just learn from their mistakes and find new victims." He leaned forward slightly. "When she married your son, I tried to warn your family. I sent letters to your home address, called your office, even hired a local investigator to make contact. No one would listen. Your son believed his wife's story about an abusive ex-husband. Your wife was the only one who responded to my attempts." My breath caught. "Eleanor knew about you? She contacted me 8 years ago, after receiving one of my letters. We spoke several times. She was the one who arranged our meetings, always careful to keep Vanessa unaware. She wanted evidence, documentation, anything that would help her protect you when the time came." Crane's expression softened. "Your wife was remarkable, Mr. Lawson. She understood exactly what she was dealing with, and she spent years preparing for the battle she knew was coming. I'm only sorry she didn't live to see it won. The call ended, and Margaret closed the laptop. With Lily's recordings, including Vanessa's admission about the Ohio scheme, combined with William Crane's testimony and the documented evidence of her current fraud attempt, we have enough for criminal charges: elder abuse, fraud, conspiracy to deprive you of civil rights. The district attorney's office has already expressed interest. She turned to Ethan, her voice gentler now. You also have grounds for immediate divorce. Given the evidence of fraud and manipulation, any competent family court judge will grant dissolution with full custody of marital assets. Vanessa brought nothing into your marriage except lies. She'll leave with nothing but consequences. Ethan sat motionless, absorbing the full scope of what his wife had done, what she had been planning to do. 20 years of his life, recontextualized as a long con executed by a professional predator. I sat in Margaret's office, surrounded by 15 years of evidence against the woman who had infiltrated my family. William Crane's final words echoed in my mind, spoken just before the video call ended. She's not just a con artist, Mr. Lawson. She's a specialist. Wealthy families with elderly patriarchs, that's her hunting ground. You and your wife are the first ones who ever built a trap strong enough to catch her. I looked at the folder in my hands, heavy with documentation of Vanessa's crimes. Tomorrow, I would offer her a choice. The same choice the Hartwell family had offered 15 years ago, though this time the terms would be different. But tonight I had one more person to thank, the woman who had saved me from beyond the grave. I called Vanessa the following evening and invited her to my home to discuss terms. I kept my voice neutral, almost conciliatory, suggesting that perhaps we could find a way to resolve our differences without further legal proceedings. She agreed immediately, her tone carrying the confident edge of someone who believed she still held cards worth playing. I suspected she thought Ethan's loyalty remained intact, that she could leverage 20 years of manipulation into some form of compromise. She did not know that her husband had spent the previous night reading his mother's journal and weeping in my living room. She arrived precisely on time, dressed impeccably, her composure restored to the polished facade I had observed for 2 decades. I met her at the door and led her to Eleanor's study, where I had arranged the space with deliberate care. Eleanor's desk sat between us, its surface cleared, except for a neat stack of folders. The leather chair where my wife had spent her final months planning this very moment waited behind the desk. I settled into it and gestured for Vanessa to take the seat across from me. She remained standing, her eyes sweeping the room with barely concealed disdain. Richard, I'm glad you've come to your senses. This conflict has been painful for everyone, especially Ethan. He's caught in the middle, torn between his wife and his father. She arranged her features into an expression of wounded reasonableness. What happened in court was a misunderstanding. We were only trying to help you. Surely we can find a way to move forward as a family. I let her continue. I had learned decades ago that people reveal themselves most clearly when they believe they are winning. Vanessa spoke for several minutes about family unity, about putting differences aside, about the importance of presenting a united front for Lily's sake. Her words were carefully chosen, each phrase designed to shift blame while appearing magnanimous. It was a masterful performance, the kind of speech that had probably worked countless times before. When she finally paused, I reached for the first folder on the desk and opened it. Do you recognize this voice? I pressed play on the small recorder Margaret had provided, and Vanessa's own words filled the room. The old man won't last long. Once we get guardianship, we control everything. Her expression flickered, just slightly, before she recovered. That's taken out of context. I was venting to a friend. You can't possibly think. I opened the second folder and placed the Ohio case file on the desk. Court documents, newspaper clippings, photographs of a younger Vanessa standing outside a Columbus courthouse. Victoria Hartwell. That was your name 15 years ago, wasn't it? Before you changed it and moved here. Before you found another wealthy family with an elderly patriarch to target. The color drained from her face. For the first time since I had known her, Vanessa appeared genuinely shaken. Those records were sealed. How did you? William Crane sends his regards. I placed his sworn statement on top of the pile. He's been tracking you for 15 years, waiting for you to strike again. He was quite eager to provide testimony. Vanessa's composure crumbled in stages. like a building collapsing floor by floor. First came denial, her voice rising with desperate assertions that the Ohio case had been a misunderstanding, that she had been the victim, that the Hartwell family had persecuted her unfairly. When denial failed, she shifted to blame. Ethan knew everything. He helped me plan the guardianship petition. If I'm guilty of anything, so is he. I placed Eleanor's journal on the desk, open to the final entry. My wife documented 20 years of your manipulation. Every lie, every isolation tactic, every manufactured conflict. This journal, combined with Lily's recordings and William Crane's testimony, tells a very complete story. At the mention of Lily's name, something shifted in Vanessa's expression. Real fear, perhaps, at the realization that her own stepdaughter had been gathering evidence under her nose for 2 years. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, the study door opened. Ethan walked in and stood beside my chair. He did not look at Vanessa. He did not speak. He simply stood there, his presence a declaration louder than any words could have been. 20 years of marriage, 20 years of carefully constructed loyalty, and he had chosen to stand with his father. Vanessa stared at her husband with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Desperation, rage, and something that might have been genuine bewilderment that her perfect system had finally failed. "Ethan," she said, her voice dropping to the soft, manipulative tone she had used so effectively for decades. "Sweetheart, you can't believe any of this. Your father is confused. He's been manipulated by that lawyer friend of Eleanor's. You know me. You know I would never." "I read my mother's journal," Ethan said quietly. "I heard your recordings. I know what you did to the Hartwell family." His voice cracked slightly. "I know what you tried to do to my father, and I know what you did to me." I pushed the final document across the desk. Divorce papers, already prepared by Margaret, requiring only Vanessa's signature. "Here are your terms. Sign these papers immediately. Relinquish all claims to family assets. Leave the state within 30 days. In exchange, no criminal charges will be filed, and the connection to Ohio will remain private." Vanessa looked at the papers, then at Ethan, then at me. The predator who had hunted wealthy families for decades was finally cornered, and she knew it. "This is blackmail. This is mercy," I said calmly. "More than you ever showed Robert Hartwell. More than you planned to show me. Take it or face a courtroom where everything comes out, and this time there will be no settlement to hide behind." Her hand trembled as she signed the divorce papers. 20 years of manipulation erased with a signature. She gathered her things mechanically, her movements stripped of the graceful confidence she had always carried. At the door, she turned back one final time. "You think you've won," she said bitterly, "but you'll never get back the years I took from you." I met her eyes steadily. "You're right. But I got back something you never counted on. My son." The door closed behind her. Ethan was crying. So was I. But for the first time in 2 decades, we were crying together. 6 months passed before the world settled into something resembling peace. Vanessa left the state within the 30-day deadline, her departure as quiet as the predator she had always been. She attempted to return to Ohio, perhaps hoping that 15 years had erased the memories of her crimes there. But William Crane had spent those years building a network of attorneys, judges, and investigators who remembered Victoria Hartwell and what she had tried to do. Word of her return spread through professional circles within days. Firms refused to hire her. Landlords declined her applications. The hunting ground she had once dominated was closed to her forever. Last I heard, she was living in a small apartment in a city far from anywhere she had ever operated, working a regular job for wages she had once considered beneath her notice. The predator who had spent decades targeting wealthy families now had nothing but what she could earn through honest labor. Some might call that justice. I called it consequence. Ethan moved into a small house 3 streets away from mine, close enough for regular visits, but far enough to rebuild his sense of independence. Our relationship healed in increments, the way all deep wounds heal, slowly and with occasional setbacks. We had dinner together every Sunday evening, sometimes sharing comfortable conversation about small things, sometimes sitting in silence that was no longer painful. On harder nights, we talked about the years we had lost, the words we could not take back, the mother and wife who had seen everything and loved us both enough to prepare for the worst. Those conversations left us exhausted, but somehow lighter, as if speaking the truth aloud released weight we had been carrying for decades. Lily finished her first year of law school with honors, specializing in elder law and family advocacy. She had found her calling in the ashes of our family's crisis, transforming the skills she had developed as a secret documentarian into a career protecting others from predators like her mother. Eleanor's journal sat on her desk in her campus apartment, a reminder that protection sometimes requires patience, sometimes requires silence, and always requires the courage to act when the moment arrives. I visited her last month and found her preparing a presentation on financial exploitation warning signs. She had titled it, "What My Grandmother Taught Me." I established the Eleanor Lawson Foundation for Elder Advocacy 6 weeks after Vanessa signed the divorce papers. Margaret helped with the legal structure, and William Crane contributed seed funding from a network of families who had been touched by similar predators. The foundation provides legal resources to seniors facing financial exploitation by family members, connecting them with attorneys, investigators, and support systems that can help them fight back before it is too late. I speak at community centers and senior organizations regularly now, sharing my story with names changed, helping others recognize the warning signs I had missed for 20 years. Every time someone approaches me afterward with tears in their eyes, saying they finally understand what has been happening in their own family, I feel Eleanor's presence beside me. Every morning, I still have coffee at Eleanor's desk. Sometimes I speak aloud to her photograph, telling her about my day, about Ethan's progress, about Lily's achievements. "We did it, my love," I told her this morning. "We protected what mattered." I stood at Eleanor's grave on the 2nd anniversary of the day everything changed. The autumn leaves swirled around my feet as I placed white lilies, her favorite, against the headstone. "They thought they could erase me," I said softly. "They forgot I had you watching over me." The wind rustled through the trees, and for a moment, I swore I heard her voice. "You were always stronger than you knew, Richard. I just made sure you had the tools to prove it." I smiled, touched the cold stone one last time, and walked back toward the parking lot where Ethan and Lily were waiting. The anniversary party where they tried to make me invisible felt like another lifetime ago, but it was not the end of my story. It was only the beginning of a life I finally chose for myself. What would you do if the people you trusted most tried to take everything from you? Would you fight back, or would you walk away? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because sometimes knowing we are not alone is the first step toward healing. If this story moved you, subscribe for more stories about family, justice, and the quiet strength it takes to reclaim your life. And remember, the most powerful revenge is not destruction. It is living well, with your dignity intact, and the people who truly love you by your side. Richard Lawson's story reminds us that the people who try to diminish us often underestimate the quiet strength we carry within. He faced betrayal from those who should have protected him, humiliation designed to break his spirit, and a calculated scheme to erase his voice from his own life. But he also had something his enemies never anticipated: a wife who loved him enough to fight for him even after death, a granddaughter brave enough to document the truth, and the patience to wait until justice could be served on his terms. This story is not just about revenge. It is about reclaiming dignity when others try to strip it away. It is about the power of preparation, the importance of documenting what we witness, and the knowledge that legal protections exist for those who seek them. Elder financial abuse affects millions of families every year, often perpetrated by the very people victims trust most. If Richard's journey resonates with you, perhaps it is time to have difficult conversations with loved ones, to understand what legal safeguards are available, and to pay attention when something feels wrong. We would love to hear from you. Have you ever faced a situation where family members tried to take advantage of your trust? How did you respond? What advice would you give to others who might be experiencing something similar? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Your story could be the one that helps someone else find the courage to fight back. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel for more powerful narratives about family, justice, and the resilience of the human spirit. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and remember, you are never too old to stand up for yourself, and it is never too late to choose the life you deserve.